a brave sight, and a sight which aroused a fierce thrill in the soul of Kull, king of Volusia. Not on the topaz throne at the front of the regal tower of splendor sat Kull, but in the saddle, mounted on a great stallion, a true warrior king. His mighty arms swung up in reply to the salutes as the hosts passed. His fierce eyes passed the gorgeous trumpeters with a casual glance, rested longer on the following soldiery. They blazed with a ferocious light as the red slayers halted in front of him with a clang of arms and a rearing of steeds, and tendered him the crown salute. They narrowed slightly as the mercenaries rode by. They saluted no one, the mercenaries. They walked with shoulders flung back, eyeing Kull boldly and straightly, albeit with a certain appreciation. Fierce eyes, unblinking, savage eyes, staring from beneath shaggy manes and heavy brows. And Kull gave back a like stare. He granted much to brave men, and there were no braver in all the world, not even among the wild tribesmen who now disowned him. But Kull was too much the savage to have any great love for these. There were too many feuds. Many were age-old enemies of Kull's nation, and though the name of Kull was now a word accursed among the mountains and valleys of his people, and though Kull had put them from his mind, yet the old hates, the ancient passions still lingered. For Kull was no Volusian, but an Atlantean. The armies swung out of sight around the gem-blazing shoulders of the Tower of Splendor, and Kull reined his stallion about and started toward the palace at an easy gait, discussing the review with the commanders that rode with him, using not many words, but saying much. The army is like a sword, said Kull, and must not be allowed to rust. That is from the Shadow Kingdom, which you can find in this magnificent volume, which I remembered to bring up here to the Rustic Vaughn Lodge. This is Robert E. Howard's Kull, Exile of Atlantis. Kull, Exile of Atlantis. And that was the Shadow Kingdom, which is a story I'm going to be talking about today. So this volume, Kull, Exile of Atlantis, has all of the Kull stories in them. Everything that Robert E. Howard wrote about Kull of Volusia is in this book. It's not very long, because there wasn't much that he actually wrote about Kull if you compared his writings about Kull to his other characters, particularly Conan. But it's really interesting stuff. And a couple of the stories in this volume are magnificent, particularly the one I'm going to be talking about today. So this volume starts off with a story that was never published during Robert E. Howard's lifetime. It has been titled Exile of Atlantis, which is the title of this volume. But in this volume, it's just titled Untitled Story. And it tells the story of Kull, and of course has a great Justin Sweet illustrations. It has a short tale of Kull when he was a youth among his savage tribe in Atlantis. And at the end of this story, some of his tribesmen are tying a young woman to a post, and they're going to burn her alive because she ran off with a man from another tribe. And they caught her. And because she ran off with an enemy, they're going to kill her. And before she can suffer too much pain, Cain, well, in this part, it says Kull, not Cain. I'm so used to talking about Solomon Kane. Kull struck as suddenly and unexpectedly as a cobra. He snatched the dagger from his girdle and threw it. Fairly under the heart it struck. killing her instantly. So he killed this woman so that she would not suffer from being burnt alive, which, of course, was a terrible crime for him to do that. So he had to hightail it out of Atlantis in a hurry. And that's the end of that story. He's hightailing it out of Atlantis. And that's just a story that's just a few pages long. And it is interesting because it gives us just a tiny bit of his background. And that's all we ever get in his story. And then it moves right on to the Shadow Kingdom. And there is a parade going on. And there is Kull sitting on his steed, watching his hosts parade before him. Great Justin Sweet illustrations in this volume. He really gets it, Justin Sweet. And the work he does in this volume is just fantastic. Really moody, really strange, which fits. So Kull has, through a series of adventures and some time as a mercenary, managed to make himself king of this mighty nation of Valusia, basically by strangling the previous king. And so he's made himself king, but he's in a precarious position because not everybody in Valusia, of course, wants Kull to be king. And so he always has to worry about, you know, somebody trying to assassinate him or unseat him or something like that. And so in this story, he's visited by a Pict who comes and invites him to meet with the Pictish ambassador, Canute, because Canute has some things he has to tell Kull. And so Kull goes to this meeting, even though he knows it's dangerous, because Kull's people from Atlantis and the Picts are age-old enemies. But he goes and meets with Canute anyway. And Canute, who becomes kind of an important character in this series, tells him that his kingdom is in great danger, not from human beings, but from an ancient evil. The ancient evil being the Serpent Men. For long ago, the Serpent Men controlled the earth. They were the dominant species. But they were knocked down out of their place by human beings. And the creepy thing about the Serpent Men is that they can take the form through magic of anyone they wish. So a lot of times the Serpent Men will take the forms of kings of nations. They'll assassinate secretly a king or a statesman or something like that and take their place to advance their evil serpent agenda. You might recognize this idea because some modern conspiracy theorists, the more out there ones, have taken this idea directly from this story for the lizard people. You know, I don't know if you've ever heard of that ridiculous conspiracy theory that, you know, the president and the queen are secretly lizard people. If you haven't heard that, that's probably for the best. But yeah, there is that conspiracy theory going on. And so they were real, of course, in Valusia. Now, Kull doesn't know if he believes this or if it's just hogwash. But he's going to go along with it. And Canute is going to send a Pict to stay with Kull and hang out with Kull. And together they will figure out a way to fight these Serpent Men who are trying to insinuate their serpent selves into Valusia. And that's what the story, The Shadow Kingdom, is about. Kull's initial battle, his initial conflict with the Serpent Men. And it's really good. There are some, I won't give the rest of the plot away, because it's a fantastic story and you should read it. But a few things about this story. Many consider this story, The Shadow Kingdom, to be the first sword and sorcery story. It might be. It has all the elements. It has a mythical world, a lost world. This one takes place long, long before human history was recorded. So it is a lost fantasy world with different fantasy nations. Has magic, has monsters, lots of sword fighting in this story. Warriors battling against monsters. So it has all of those elements that you'd want from a sword and sorcery story. So Robert E. Howard was building up sword and sorcery without really knowing it. And of course, he took a lot of the elements from this series to his Conan stories. But you'll notice the difference between Conan and Kull if you've read Conan stories when you read this Kull story. The atmosphere is different. It's much darker. The Lost World is much stranger and more nebulous. All the names are weirder. The Picts we recognize, because the Picts are in a lot of Robert E. Howard stories. And Kull is a broody, dark king. He's not Conan. He's a lot darker than Conan is. He's very, very distrustful. And he can break out into a savage red rage at any moment. So he's dangerous. But he's a good king despite all that. And you get the feeling that he's the best king Volusia's had for a while. And he is the kind of guy you want when you've got to fight a bunch of magic serpent people, which they have to in this story. And I have to say, the serpent people are really, really creepy. Robert E. Howard does a good job on the serpent people. There are some other supernatural things in this story, which I won't mention because I don't want to ruin it for you, but they're there and they're very well done. One of the things you recognize right away when you read this story is just how well written it is. Very well written story. The prose is excellent. Also, the relationship between Brule the Spear Slayer, which is the guy that has to hang out with Kull, and Kull is really interesting. Initially, they distrust each other and they piss each other off because their peoples have been, fighting each other for ages. But through the course of the story, they realize just how much they have in common. They have a common enemy, and they become great allies. And they become great allies throughout the stories. Brule is a major character in all the Kull stories. And their relationship is really interesting. The back and forth between these two characters is interesting. They come across as real people. And that's one of the things that's cool about this series, is that the people in this series seem like they could be real people. They're not cardboard cutouts at all, which are the kind of characters you'd very often see in pulp stories. This is very different from that. And so it's no surprise that it was so well received. This was a very well received story in Weird Tales. And it kind of raised Robert E. Howard's fame because it was just that good. It was a lot better than a lot of people were used to reading in the pulp stories. And it is one of the stories that made H.P. Lovecraft take great notice of Robert E. Howard and realize just how good this guy actually was. And so it's a great story. I highly recommend it. It is a magnificent beginning to a series, certainly. Because not only is it the best Kull story, it is one of the best stories that Robert E. Howard ever wrote. If I were ever to do a top 10 list of Robert E. Howard's greatest stories, Shadow Kingdom would be in there. And it's just a really excellent story. So there you go. Read that story. Next week, we'll be talking about the Mirrors of Tuzan Thune, a weird story. So yeah, there you go. That's all I have to say about Cull today. Thank you for joining me here at the Rustic Vaughn Lodge for the Robert E. Howard Show. I appreciate you joining me. Catch me tomorrow. Tomorrow should, barring accident or incident, be Halls of Adventure. I'll be back at the back at the stately Vaughn Manor. Back at the stately Vaughn Manor with Roger. And it'll be a thrilling time. So I will catch you then.